This is This Week in Common Sense by Paul Jacob for the first full week of August 2019. And the big issue this week was shootings. So, Paul, how many times did you talk about shootings this week?
We dealt with it some. We did a piece on the atrocity exhibition on Tuesday. Of course, the shootings were over the weekend. And then I think it was Wednesday that we had the piece Courage and Wisdom, ? That just basically took what Trump had said. He came up with 5 things that could be done. And I think, there's some other things that could be done beyond what his list. But I think a lot of his list isn't very effective, from the red flag laws, which I think can be problematic legally, constitutionally, but also in a lot of places have not been used. In other words, they passed a red flag law, but there have been no red flags. I believe that's true in the District of Columbia. There was an article in the Washington Post today about that. But it's part of it is we want a solution to the problem. Kind of like sometimes we want a cure for a disease. Nothing wrong with that. Obvious, we don't like people to die. But I think that then we rush into these, well, if we just do something, it will solve the problem. And of course, as we pointed out this week, on the left, it's let's rush to pass new laws on guns, almost never with any expectation, even among the people proposing it, that particular change would have stopped this terrible incident that just happened, or, of course, would stop the next one. And one of my pet peeves, I look around every once in a while and, kind of surf the web hoping to see if there's any stories on it. But after the Sulphur Springs mass shooting in Texas at the church, that person had gotten a gun, had passed a background check after he had been convicted of domestic violence, and it was a military conviction, and that information was not sent to the database, and so was not in the database, and so he sailed through, got his guns, killed, I believe, 20-something people. And, to me, every time there's a shooting, every time there's somebody saying, hey, we need to expand background checks, I'm not excited about having background checks when a father gives his son a gun, or uncle gives his nephew a gun, or it doesn't have to be male gendered, whoever gives whoever that is a friend or a close associate or family member a gun. I'm not really looking for a background check there. And I don't think that that's really the problem, that we don't have broad enough background checks. I think the bigger problem is that those background checks are working with a database that is not up to date. And it's like so many things, we seem to care about advocating something and signaling our virtue, but we don't seem to be very diligent about making sure that someone's actually stopped from getting a weapon that they shoot a bunch of innocent people with. If I were president of the United States, if I were in the Congress, I would be screaming every week on what's the update? Have all the armed services sent all their information into the database? How current are we? How do we get a system that tells us on a regular basis how current we are? In other words, how do we start checking? We really do not want someone who shouldn't have a gun to show up in a public place and murder a bunch of people. We really don't want that to happen. So why don't we, since the linchpin to so much of this seems to be this background database, this database of people who've committed crimes or things like that wouldn't be able to get a gun, working that database into something that's reliable is really darn important. And really, we almost never hear anything about it. Maybe it's not sexy enough or something, but it sure seems to me that is probably the thing we can most control And that rather than running around like we have to do something right after there's been a horrible incident, which frankly sometimes is the worst time to do anything. I mean, there are times where maybe, oh, now we've seen the light, but I think we all recognize none of these shootings have brought everyone to the same page as to exactly what should happen. And of course, it's not just the left with gun control. Folks on the right, I mean, if I have to hear that it's video games one more time, it's just, it's just pretty easy, I think, to tell that that's not the key factor that's pushing people over the edge. And in fact, I think the other thing that people have to realize about these sorts of shootings, this is someone with an incredible amount, whether they're technically mentally ill or they're not, is an open question sometimes. But I think what isn't questionable is that they have a heaping helping of hatred and anger, um, and are willing to lash out in ways that are just, unbelievable. And that level of disaffection, that level of kind of anger and alienation, that's a big problem. And that's a big, if you get rid of all the guns, someone with that level of alienation and hatred and antisocial, energy is just a dangerous, dangerous person. We got to do whatever we can to avoid creating or facilitating or enabling in any way that sort of behavior. And in essence, I don't think that's a program. I don't think that's a government program that, oh, well, we started doing this and then there was no more of that. I think it's a matter of people not falling through the cracks, of seeing kids who are, in bad situations and trying to get them out of that situation, or better that situation. It's a lot of little acts of caring and love, and probably not a bureaucratic or a law being passed, or a bureaucratic change that somehow works some magic.
There's two things about these shooters that interest me. Most of these are drugged individuals on some sort of antidepressant or on Ritalin or something similar. And another is that almost all of them are young men without fathers in the household. These are broken homes. And you were speaking of what little things we can do, what caring could do. Well, one of the things is that these kids don't have a father. These boys don't have fathers in the homes, and that's a problem for boys, I would think. So it's interesting to see how that would be dealt with, if we even dealt with it at all in the general discussion. But it doesn't seem to get anywhere, and it seems to be only among conservatives that they talk about it. Both seem to be reasonable conversations.
You'll recall I did a commentary 3, 4, 5 years ago. There was a black writer, I'm going to forget his name, who wrote something about enough already on all the fatherlessness as the problem in the Black community. And of course, increasingly, these communities don't stop and start. But anyway, he had argued that it's not fatherlessness that's the problem; it's institutional racism. And I think we have to look for any racism that's been institutionalized and uninstitutionalize it. And we have to be careful to do that in a way that doesn't reinstitutionalize some anti somebody else racism. And here I'm meaning anti-white racism or anti-Asian racism. Those guys, those Asian folks keep scoring well on all these tests. We got to do something, except we don't. We have to give people more opportunities instead of, pull on somebody's legs so that somebody else can catch up with them. The argument that somehow institutional racism is holding back folks, but fatherlessness is no big problem, I think is ridiculous. And it was interesting to me, and in the course of writing this piece, I posted something on Facebook, and there was a big discussion, a lot of people from different angles, and some of us were talking about it, and a woman chimed in and kind of goaded us that, hey, isn't this just what we need, a bunch of white guys talking about what Black people should do. And of course, I thought, I hope that nobody who's Black will ever see that I've got something in my teeth, or my one sock and not both, and not say, hey, you might want to go brush your teeth, or you might want to whatever the social oops thing. I hope that people from different races could comment without us all feeling like we're walking on eggshells. We're on the same planet. We live and work with each other. We marry each other. We have kids with each other. It really is kind of past time to be walking on eggshells. But the bigger impact of what she said was to drive me crazy, because this is not about the Black community. Fatherlessness is not a problem that exists in the Black community and is somehow non-existent everywhere else. That is, the truth is, the increase in, I believe it was 1965, that 25% of Black births were out of wedlock. I believe that at that same time it was about 5% of white children were born out of wedlock. Fast forward to all these years later, and it's now just over 70% of Black children are born out of wedlock. And it is 25%, I believe, of white children. These are rough. I could be off. And, I didn't check the stats before I came on. But but what that says is that fatherlessness in the Black community is increasing threefold in all those years. It has increased fivefold in the white community, from 5 to 25. Now, it's a better situation overall, but if we think that somehow that's a problem that doesn't affect us, it does. And I think it's a hugely serious problem. I spent a very short period of time in federal re-education camp for refusing to register for the military draft when I was a young man. And not a lot of time, 5.5 months. But I have a certain experience around criminals and my fellow criminals. And one of the things you noticed is that a lot of them very bright, but almost none of them were well educated. Almost none of them had intact families, especially didn't have fathers. And we know that from it's not always that a family breaks up and the father leaves and never says boo again to the kids. Sometimes the father ends up taking the kids and the mother leaves and isn't in contact. Sometimes people get divorced. It's a terrible thing, but it's maybe the best of choices, and it works out just fine. But most times when there's a breakup in a marriage, the father is gone. And that's why it's a much more serious problem of fatherlessness than motherlessness. And I just, to think that has no impact. I mean, I had a tremendous family around me, relatives, aunts and uncles and grandparents, and lots of brothers and sisters. I don't know how you take my dad out of that and it holds up. And I just don't think, I just think this is so self-evident that is a huge problem. And again, it's not that if we make inroads on that problem, there's never going to be a mass shooting again. The world doesn't work that way. But rather than running around with our, like we're chickens with our heads cut off and just do something, I think we have to look at what can we do that we agree on, and how can we start taking steps in that direction? And you can say, well, fatherlessness, there may not be a governmental policy that needs to change there. Maybe not. I suspect there are, but maybe not. But we don't always have to be focused on governmental solutions to everything. And it strikes me that this particular problem is of mass shootings, and the bigger problem of loneliness and alienation, and of people growing up without the love and support network that we would want every human being to have. those are problems that, frankly, are not going to be solved by who wins the next election. And I think more and more we need to, as political people who care about our society, be engaged in more than politics.
Paul Jacob writes a column 5 days a week at thisiscommonsense.com.